You're listening to a sermon originally recorded by Schweitzer United Methodist Church in Springfield, Missouri. Check us out online at sumc.co. And if this sermon blessed you, be sure to share it with someone else. Thank you so much for listening. Now, on to the message.
I'm Pastor Jason, one of the pastors here at Schweitzer. It's a joy to see you today, joy to be in worship. And the Lord has just given us 2 really awesome days, hasn't he? And so it's good to be up and going and good to be in God's presence. I think God deserves a praise offering of praise. Can we clap to God for that? I don't know about you, but I just... days like yesterday and today, they just make my heart sing. I don't know, like we could just have the band keep going and sing songs because it's just something in there. Well, today we start a new sermon series here at Schweitzer called Be Part of This. And in the next several weeks, we're going to be taking a look at 5 significant components of who Schweitzer is and how those components shape us and speak to us and help show us where God wants to take us into the future. As we do that, we're going to be hearing a number of stories about how God has been leading us, where God has led us to, things that God's put in our path, things that He's asked us to do, both within the past year and also things He's asking us to do now. We're also going to celebrate what God's been up to because there's some pretty significant things, some pretty awesome stories of God's presence and His hand in our midst. And so we want to celebrate what God has been up to. At the same time, in the midst of saying, Lord, what are you asking us to do now? So we want to be obedient. We want to celebrate what God's been up to. We also want to say, Lord, keep guiding us, keep showing us the way, keep being our leader out into the future. So we want to be praying that prayer as well. What do you have in front of us? Today we're going to be looking at the component of community impact. It's a significant piece of who Schweitzer is. I was thinking this morning about, as I saw those pictures come across the screen up there, there's a picture of Pastor Bob and Ed Hewlett, and they're standing next to a truck. And on the truck, it's a box truck. I don't know if we've named this particular truck or not, but it's a box truck. There used to be one before it that was yellow, and so we called it Tweety Bird. This one's not yellow, so we don't call it Tweety Bird. Anyway, on that side of that truck, it says Schweitzer's, the church that serves. Our sense of being engaged, our desire to be engaged in the community is pretty significant around here. Have you ever stepped back and asked yourself the question, why? In your own personal life, in your own personal story. Yesterday I saw some people were part of a cancer walk. What are the things that motivate you? What are the things that motivate us to do the things that we do, to be involved in the places we're involved? Why do we seek to make an impact in the community? In Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, in the second letter that he writes to them, he writes these words. And one of the things that we ought to know about this letter to the church at Corinth is that Paul is on a missionary journey, and he's visiting a number of churches, and he's going from Greece back to Jerusalem. His destination at this point is Jerusalem. And all the churches that he's going to go visit, he's picking up an offering. He's receiving an offering that the churches themselves are bringing together, and they're entrusting into Paul's hands, and Paul is then going to receive it and take it to Jerusalem, because the church in Jerusalem has got a couple of pressures upon them. One pressure that they face is that they're in a drought, a season of drought. And when you live in the kind of place that the land of Israel is today, and when you encounter a drought, it can be detrimental to how you grow things and how you eat, how you have food to survive. The other thing that the church in Jerusalem is facing is they're facing some political pressure. They've begun to talk about Jesus enough that people in Jerusalem themselves don't take a lot of sympathy. They don't have a lot of pity for the church. And so where you have tight resources and you also are on the outside of things, you tend not to have resources come your way. And so Paul is going around to different churches and he's receiving an offering that people want to send to Jerusalem. In the middle of talking about what kind of offering they would like to give, what kind of heart that one could give with, Paul comes here to chapter 5 and he says these words. And everything, and he's written something a little bit in front of this, but he says, all of this is a gift from God who brought us back to himself through Christ. God has given us a task of reconciling people to him. For God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. And he gave us this wonderful message of reconciliation. So we are Christ's ambassadors. God is making his appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back to God. For God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sin, so that we could be made right with God through Christ. Now this passage has a number of words that are repeated in it. I've been working on a writing project recently, and I sent my writing off to an editor. The editor has sent some things back to me, and she circled places where I had words that were repeated too often, in her opinion. And she's like, you need to find a thesaurus or find some synonyms along these ways. But in this passage, Paul uses the word reconciliation over and over and over again. In the middle of this letter where he says, I'm going to come and receive an offering to take to Jerusalem, in the middle of that letter, he talks about the central feature that is making his heart throb. And that is this, that God in Christ has sought that we should be reconciled to him. And so he sent Christ into the world to be the bridge of reconciliation, to connect with us. And the message that we've received is now something that we are entrusted with and we're challenged with to share. We are challenged to be people who share the message of reconciliation with the people of the world. And so this sense of an offering, this sense of a gift that's going to be conveyed from Corinth and the rest of the churches in Greece to Jerusalem is not just something that is supposed to meet a physical need in the moment of time that Paul gets there. No, in fact, what Paul is really saying to us, and I think he would say uniquely to us, where we have this thriving desire in a lot of places in our own heart to really do good in the world. Paul would say to us that at the end of the day, you can build big barns and they can store lots of food. Or you can take lots of bandages and put them on wounds. But the God that we serve, the God who sent Christ into the world, is a God who's interested in feeding something more than just the belly. He's interested in feeding the deepest need of the human soul. And God is interested in more than just putting Band-Aids on the wounds of the human heart, but he's interested in healing us and transforming us. And so Paul has this sense of mission and ministry. But he says what God is really after is this great work of reconciliation. And you and I, Paul himself in the church in Corinth, he says, you love to serve. That is fantastic. Recognize this. Your first act of service is to be an ambassador for Christ. To be somebody who talks about how Christ has met you and transformed you. And his work of transformation is being lived out in you and into the rest of the community that you live in. So when we think about community impact, when we think about a church that serves, one of the things that we want to have at the heart of that, the very center of that reality, is this. That we don't just serve because service is good, but we serve because at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day, God desires reconciliation. He desires people to be transformed by his power, to be connected to him and to have a sense of right righteousness and holiness throughout everything that their lives touch. That's God's passion and his desire. In the next few moments, we're going to take a look at the number of things that are connected in or written about in your bulletin. There, if you open your bulletin up, if you've got one, you'll see a header called Community Impact, and there are all kinds of things that we want to touch on here in the next few moments. Those are things that are happening in the midst of our walls here at Schweitzer, ways in which God's reconciliation, his work of reconciliation, is taking shape. And there are also ways that we can be a part of God's presence and his work of reconciliation. The first thing on the list is Church of the Center. Church of the Center started around 2013, and right now it meets over in the Outreach Center at 5 o'clock. If you want to experience it, or if you're unable to come to this experience at 9:40, you want to worship in a place, we'd invite you to come and check out Church of the Center. It's at 5 o'clock Sunday night. It's a great experience. Many of the folks who find themselves at Church of the Center are coming from a recovery community. And many of them find themselves at Church of the Center somewhat out of peer pressure with the other places where they live. They're invited, and this is something that they've been told is helpful and beneficial to them. But for many of the folks who are at Church of the Center, they come with a sense of, I don't know if I'm acceptable to God. At least that's at the beginning of their experience. They wonder, is this a place where I can find a place to fit? And they wonder, how is it that God is going to interact with me? What they find through the worship service, what they find through God's Spirit at work in that place, is that God desires everyone to be reconciled to himself. And one of the beautiful things, one of the beautiful stories that is told often at Church of the Center, in a time within the service called Life Change Stories, is when people stand up and they begin to talk about how God's power has been present in their life. And when they start to walk with God, God's power begins to be displayed in other places. And that work of reconciliation between God and themselves begins to be played out between themselves and other people. And people will oftentimes talk about how they haven't seen family or they haven't seen their kids in years. And God's power and his presence, his work of reconciliation begins to build bridges that have been missing for a long time. The next thing on the list there is the Life Change Plan. The Life Change Plan is a program. It's a year-long discipleship plan that people who recognize that they need some more accountability in their life. They need a really directed plan. A number of the folks at Church of the Center have entered the Life Change Plan. This past year, we've had 12 graduates. 8 of those, after graduation, are continuing to be healthy in their walk with the Lord. And we've had some folks that sat down with KJ and talked about the significance of the Life Change Plan in their life. And so I'd like to invite you to watch the screen as we listen to Amber talk about the significance of the Life Change Plan in her life.
I went to my PO and I told her I didn't know what to do. I told her I wanted to go into New Beginnings. And so she said, listen, this lady just brought me this flyer. It's called the Life Change Plan. She said, I have no idea what it's about.
Sounds like Chris has been hustling.
Yes, Krista she is a miracle worker. And so my PO at the time told me, here's her number. She got her name wrong. She was like, her name is Krista Rosenbog. So I called Krista and I was like, I'm looking for Krista Rosenbog. And she didn't even correct me. She was like, yeah, my name's Krista. And I was like, I need to know about your Life Change Plan. And Krista said, okay, come into service on Sunday. So I came to Schweitzer's that next Sunday and I've been here ever since. I don't know, I just feel at home.
Yeah.
I felt loved and invited, and nobody cared what my past was. Nobody cared what my outward appearance was. I was seeking God, and that's all they cared about. I got into the Life Change Plan because I needed something different. I knew that NA didn't work to keep me clean. I knew there's still something missing in my life. And unfortunately, I'm very stubborn, and it took me losing everything to turn to where I needed to go. But even in the process of losing everything, I am the happiest in my life right now that I ever have been.
Wow.
Because I've got a relationship with somebody who I know loves me no matter what.
Yeah. Wow.
The Life Change Plan is a beautiful experience. If you'd like to be a participant in the Life Change Plan, you can talk to Kristen Rosenbaum. She helps lead that up. Or if you'd like to be a mentor, one of the beautiful aspects about the Life Change Plan is that everybody who enters it is connected to a mentor. If you're interested in that, you can write that on your connection card, or you can talk with David Freeman or Kristen Rosenbaum. They'd be happy to talk to you. The next item on the list is Alpha. Alpha is a 12-week class offering that's open to people who are investigating the faith. They've got questions about Jesus. And at Alpha, every question that you have about Jesus is free to be asked. And hopefully a lot of those questions that are asked will be answered. Alpha is a place that this past year, close to 80 people have taken the class. They've taken a look at who Jesus is and desire to walk closer to Jesus. Both Amber and Wendy have got a story about how Alpha is something that has been impactful in their life. Let's take a look.
What's one discussion that really stuck out in your mind?
There's not really one particular one because I've not really been educated as a child about the Bible. I mean, I knew about the Bible. I went to church with my grandparents, but if you wanted to read the Bible, there it was on the shelf.
So I knew who Jesus was, I knew who God was, but I didn't know the fine details.
Okay.
And that's kind of what Alpha's done. It's kind of sharpened those fine details. It shows you what everything is. It shows you why this is the path you want to walk. And then it reassures those questions, those doubts that you have in your mind. Because I don't know for anybody else, but for me, those doubts like to cloud my judgment a lot when it comes to it.
I've got tons of doubts.
Yeah, tons of them. And Alpha kind of helps take those away a little bit.
Yeah.
There's one quote they constantly repeat in there, and it's from C.S. Lewis. And he constantly says, if Christianity is false, then you have nothing to worry about. But if it's not, you have everything to worry about.
Yeah, that's massive.
And that sunk in with me because it's so deep because it gets to that point of why not? You might as well give this a shot. And I've tried everything else in my life to try to be happy, and this is the only thing that's brought me true happiness.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's a story of Alpha. The next Alpha class will begin in February. If you've got questions about Jesus, things you'd like to explore, we invite you to be a part of Alpha. If you've already been a part of Alpha and you want to contribute, that's a ministry that has an interest in your own heart. There's always a place for people to be table leaders, where people can sit down and they can host those conversations. They can help guide the discussion about where people can connect with Jesus. The next item on our list there is Faith and Finances. Faith and Finances is a 12-week plan where people who struggle with some of the basics about finance get connected to an ally, and they begin to learn about some things like budgeting and getting a checking account, having a checking account that's in good shape. And Gary is a guy who's taken the class of Faith and Finances, and his story is up next.
It really, really, really makes you look at what you're spending. And for me, it was way too much.
Yeah.
On stupid things.
Do you find yourself questioning yourself throughout the day whether you really need that or not if you go into like a convenience store?
Yes, actually going through that class has stopped me from buying a lot of things.
Yeah, a lot of energy drinks.
How'd you figure it out?
Well, I have the benefit of David Freeman dropping me a line about some energy drink spending. But you know what? I'm totally there with you. There are times, it's not energy drinks for me, it's coffee. There are times that I have coffee at home and I'm like, but I could go to Starbucks. And I usually lose that battle every time.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, we got in his truck the other day, Amber and I did. Sure enough, we seen what was it? Starbucks energy drink.
An energy shot and an open
We're just
energy
like, we'll
drink.
help you drink this, Gary. We each
I try to help him with this problem.
Yeah, sure.
You
Just
got
as
the
friends.
shot.
Yeah, you're there to hold him accountable by
Yeah.
drinking.
Yes. We're just trying to dispose of this problem. That's
Right,
all.
yeah.
Yeah, we're just
I think they had a lot of good time laughing in that segment. One of the things that was missed along the way was that reconciliation touches our finances. Gary got a handle on his finances, and so much of a handle on his finances that he hadn't had a vehicle for a long time. He realized if he just quit spending in some places, that he would have enough for a vehicle and he'd have enough for insurance, and the dude is thriving because he's finding reconciliation with God and with other elements of his life. Some of the other things that we have here, we'd love to point your attention to, is Jobs for Life. Jobs for Life is a ministry that a number of you have heard about. It's an 8-week class for people that are trying to either get a job or improve the job where they're at. It's a class that helps people understand their soft skills. They get a sense of their attitude. They get a sense of their character, things that need to come to the job place with them. This last year, we've had 3 classes of Jobs for Life. We've had 27 graduates, and I think we have a picture of those graduates from this past week up there. One of the key components of Jobs for Life is that we have champions, and champions are people that walk alongside Jobs for Life students, and they get to hear their story, and they get to tell their own story, and they get to be encouragers, and they get to say, come on, you can do this. And they get to be, if you like being a cheerleader, I mean, you don't have to put on an outfit, right? But if you like to be a cheerleader, that's a place for somebody like you. We've got the Coach House. The Coach House is a transitional house that was opened here at Schweitzer a couple years ago. This past year, we've had 6 women that have come into the Coach House, which is usually a 3 to 6 month time span. They get connected with a mentor, they get connected into a Bible study plan, and they develop a plan about how they're going to move from being somebody who's either homeless or in transition to a more permanent place. And the Coach House is a beautiful ministry, and there's always a place for somebody to serve at the Coach House. What do we have up next, Kathy? We've got the Coach House, the Food Pantry. The Food Pantry has been a staple ministry around Schweitzer. And it's a place where a lot of people connect with God for the first time or reconnect with God. This year, we'll have connected with about 3,000, just over 3,000 families, or 3,000 people will connect with the Food Pantry here at Schweitzer. One of the things that we often don't say or we don't know, it just kind of flies under the radar, is that over this past year, about 320,000 pounds of food went through the Food Pantry. Now, that obviously didn't go through to the 3,050 people that went through. But we help places like Harmony House, and we help places like Safe to Sleep. And we have actually food pantries all over southwest Missouri that we connect with. And so actually about 35,000 people were helped through the food ministry of the Schweitzer Food Pantry. And that becomes possible because people serve. They serve in all kinds of different ways, and people give. And they give in all kinds of different ways. The Pittman Partnership is something that Pastor Jim Mason, several years ago now, was driving around in the community, and he'd been challenged both by a sermon about asking the question, where are we at? Where are we investing in the community? And I really think he was challenged by the Holy Spirit. And he has an interesting way of driving. He just kind of lets the Spirit take the car wherever it's supposed to go. And you better be prayed up because you might need your angels with you along the way. So one day he pulled into Pittman School, the neighborhood school right just a couple blocks from us. And he walked in, and he didn't know what he was going to find. He just walked in to see who the leader was and ask a simple question. I wonder if there's some way that we at Schweitzer can be connected with you, if there's something we could do. And in that moment, he met Principal Laura, and they started to talk about tutoring. That was the first thing that they began to talk about. And Principal Laura sat down, and she had this to say about the tutoring that takes place at Pittman.
It may have been my first year at Pittman that Jim Mason came by, just kind of on a whim. We just sat down and had a pretty informal conversation, and he asked what Schweitzer could do to support Pittman, and at that time I threw out several ideas. We had a need for tutors and tutoring. We have lots of kids that struggle academically, and I knew that there were several retired teachers that attended here, and so I just said that would be an awesome way to help kids. Is if we could get a group of people, especially the retired teachers, to tutor kids that just need that extra support. And that's how it started.
Nice. So first year to now, what did you start with? What's it grown to?
Gosh, I think we started with 7 or 8 tutors, and now we have 17.
What?
We have 17 tutors.
That's crazy.
This fall. Yeah, I mean, we're able to help more kids than we've ever been able to help. And they love it. Some of our tutors have been able to stay with the same kid year after year, which, you know, they build that bond and that relationship, and it's just another caring adult that's helping them to achieve and reach their goals, and it's awesome.
That is super cool.
Yeah.
Pittman Tutors started with around 7. This year at 17. One of the concerns that they've begun to develop is we wonder if there's going to be enough room for the tutors, because we're tutoring and we're taking tutors there, and it's a beautiful thing, and you can be a tutor if you want, but they're a great problem to have. Their great problem to have is wondering, where is there going to be room to do this tutoring? Now, the tutoring they know is needful. They know it's necessary. It's a problem that I guess some other people get to help solve, right? But it's a great place to serve. And there's all kinds of things that happen in the partnership between us and Pittman that started with that sense of Pittman tutoring. There's a ministry called All Pro Dad, which a number of the guys who are part of Movers and Shakers have been a part of. And All Pro Dad is a breakfast once a month where dads and their kids can come in, they can have breakfast and be encouraged. At the first breakfast this year, they had 120 dads and kids that showed up to be a part of the All Pro Dad to get encouragement along the way. If you're interested in that, you can connect with the folks at Movers and Shakers. One of the other ministries that we have there at Pittman is the Good News Club. And at the Good News Club, kids stay after school and they hear stories about Jesus. They hear how Jesus cares about them and how they can connect with him. We also have a ministry there called the Sense of Pride. And Sense of Pride is a store where once a month, kids can come into a little room at Pittman that's set aside for this, and they see things laid out, and they can buy stuff for themselves. Sometimes they're encouraged to buy stuff for themselves, like school supplies. But Laura Brand, who runs a Sense of Pride store, she often remarks, especially around Thanksgiving and Christmas time, how kids come in and they look to buy stuff for a friend of theirs in the classroom, and they look to buy stuff for their mom or dad. You know, stuff that's either been donated or stuff that has been picked up rather inexpensively. They look to buy those things because it's something that they can give away. And there's something powerful about that store that's there. And then also, what else do we have? We got one other thing there, right? The backpacks. And Pittman, like a lot of schools within Springfield, are schools where they have a lot of kids on free and reduced lunch. And every Friday, backpacks go home with a number of those kids. And a number of people at Schweitzer help make those backpacks available. They provide food. They take food from here up to that place. And they make sure that kids have backpacks that they can go home with over the weekend. Those are a lot of things that are happening. There's one other item that I guess we need to touch on that's on the list there on the sheet, and that's the East Stanford Neighborhood Garden. That's right on the north side of the parking lot. If you want to see what a awesome neighborhood garden looks like, I'd recommend you go take a look at that. And there's all kinds of people, over 50 gardeners, and from all kinds of places, local and around the city, that garden in that place and have begun to build a sense of neighborhood and community connectedness. It's really cool to watch the kids too from Grodino Preschool go over and pay attention to their plots and pay attention to how things grow and what God is doing. And it's pretty awesome too to see and to hear about neighbors that have lived across the street that have never connected, that because a neighborhood garden is in their neighborhood, they begin to connect and know one another and care for one another. The Apostle Paul, at the end of chapter 5, it goes into chapter 6, and he says this: He's talked about the significance of reconciliation, and he's talked about how we can be reconcilers. And so he says, as God's partners, we beg you not to accept this marvelous gift of God's kindness and then ignore it. For God says, at just the right time I heard you, and on the day of salvation I helped you. Indeed, the right time is now. Today is the day of salvation. Friends, there's a lot of things that God is doing in our community, and he's doing through Schweitzer. And there are a lot of things to give thanks to God for, a lot of stories. But there's always that question out in front of us, right? Like, if today is the day that we get to join with God, what is it that God's putting in front of us? What is it that God's asking us to do? Where's the place where God would say, can you come alongside of me? Can you be a part of my work of reconciliation? I'm sure that there's something on that sheet that God would put in front of you, put in front of your heart. Or you could think of it in another way. There's a way that all of us can be involved with what God is doing through these ministries. And we could say it like this: God can use our blood, our sweat, and our tears. Recently, I realized that I was old when I mentioned that there was a band called Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And there were people around me who didn't know that that was a band. But God can use our blood, sweat, and tears. Our blood is our sense of our energy, our time, our physical presence. We can give of our time, and we can give of our effort to make some of these things happen. Our sweat is the sweat of our brow, the sweat with which we bring home the bread which we eat. It's the ministry that we can, of giving money, of making things happen in that way. In just a moment, the ushers are going to come and they're going to receive our offering. And we are really thankful for your generosity, because your generosity makes these ministries happen. But even as the ushers receive that, know that God keeps putting that out in front of us. How will you give? And November 11th will be a day of commitment where we think about 2019 and how we'll give. And you'll be hearing more about that. The last thing, blood, sweat, and tears. Tears are like our prayers. Tears represent our prayers. The work of this ministry, if it doesn't center on the reconciliation work of Christ, if it doesn't come back to and keep coming back to the power of God, well, friends, it's just work that it someday becomes tiresome. But there's a joy in it. There's a celebration in it because God's power and his presence is there within it. And God is connecting to people who need to be reconciled. He's asking us to be people who reconcile to others. This last week ago, Sunday night, Norma Gordon, who's somewhere between 80s and 90s. Norma normally comes to the 11 o'clock modern service, but she's decided that she needs to be at Church of the Center. She comes to bring a presence and a ministry of prayer. And Norma was facing a tough week. This last week had something in it that Norma was just deeply concerned about. Her heart was heavy. And in a moment when people normally stand up and they tell their life change story, Norma got up and she began to identify with the story of many of the people in the room. She said, many of you have been to jail. I haven't been in jail, but I've been in my own prisons. And she began to talk. Tears began to come down her face. And she said, I don't know all the addictions that you have, and I don't know that I've shared those, but I've had my own addictions, and tears just came. And one of the girls in the room, she got up and she went around Norma. She put her arms around her. She's almost like, you don't have to cry. We're here with you. And Norma's like, honey, the tears are just the tears of my reliance upon God. And we need people, we need all of us, to be people who are invested with our blood, our sweat, and our tears. Because God is invested with his blood, his sweat, and his tears. And that's the invitation he invites to us. As we've been reconciled, let us too be reconcilers.